Hello, Michael Kelly. I'm going to be reading from my book For Fear of Little Men, which has just been updated on Kindle to sort out a few minor formatting issues. So to mark the occasion, I thought I'd read one of the stories. And this is the story of the Moddey Doo, which is one of the most famous of the Manx supernatural tales. This is my telling of it. On the western coast of the Isle of Man is the little fishing town of Peel. Actually, it's the only one of the island's towns to be rightly called a city, for the island's sole cathedral stands in Peel. But it's a quiet and restful place, with boats passing to and from the harbour, carrying the day's catch. Its welcoming bay has not always been considered without its problems, however. Not only does it permit good sailing for the fishermen of the town, it's also an easy and obvious target for seaborne invasion. This was especially perilous in the Viking Age. Ironically, it was Vikings who decided to make arrangements for the town's defence. When the Viking fleet, led by Godred Crovan, landed on the Isle of Man in 979, they fought a long, hard battle and ultimately triumphed. The invaders were so impressed with the valour of the Manxmen that they permitted the survivors to live after their surrender, and Crovan offered his men a choice: to ransack the island and depart with its treasures, or to remain and settle. The Vikings chose to settle, intermarrying with the Manx. Celtic and Norse culture and beliefs intertwined, and Godred Crovan became King Orry of Man. Being raiders themselves, the new Viking lords of Man understood that Peel Harbour lay wide open to attack from the sea, and their eyes turned to a small rocky island that rose out of the water at the southern extremity of the bay. This islet was separated from the mainland by a narrow channel and had steep cliffs and rocks on all sides, rising to a commanding height. This natural defensive outlook had been host to a small community for several centuries, including monks and missionaries who had Christianized the Manx before the Vikings had arrived and set about repaganizing them. The name they had given to this small rocky outcrop was St. Patrick's Isle. Now the Vikings established a defensive foothold on it, building wooden fortifications and mooring their ships so that they could watch over the approach from the sea. The fortifications, which came to be known by the simple name of Peel Castle, were reinforced, rebuilt and extended many times over the years, threatened by sea raiders, Scotsmen and English troops during the Civil War. Wood was replaced by stone until a large solid structure stood there, surrounded by a stone curtain wall on all sides, a sturdy defence against any invader. When the English Civil War was over, King Charles II was restored to the British throne, and Charles, Earl of Derby, bore the title of King of Man. The imposing castle was now garrisoned by his soldiers. Every night, after the day's business was done, the great front gate of the castle would be closed and locked. There was a guard room near the gate, just inside the entrance, usually manned by 3 of the soldiers, and when the gate had been locked, one of the men would take the keys down the passage which led from the guard room to the office of the captain of the guard. Despite the rough stone walls and the low ceiling, the guard room was not a cheerless place at night. There was plenty of candlelight, and a large fire was lit to keep out the cold, plus liquor enough to warm the soul. Nor were there any real threats to the island's shores after the conclusion of the Civil War. So the lives of the soldiers garrisoned at Peel were quite easy. Nevertheless, a creeping chill began to grip their hearts. None of them could recall when the dog first appeared. They began to see it out of the corners of their eyes as they walked down that dim passageway carrying the keys. They would be conscious of something watching them from the shadows as they passed the entrance to one of the rooms that lay on their route. When they looked within, a great black dog would be sitting there, staring fixedly at them. It began to appear increasingly frequently, always at night, always after the gate had been locked. They didn't know where it came from, nor where it went. No matter how vigilant they were, the dog always appeared when gloom filled that narrow passage, padding silently from one room to the next. As time passed, it took to entering the guardroom itself. As the key turned in the lock, closing the castle to the outside world, and the man with the keys returned to the guardroom before making his way to the captain's office, the dog would follow close on his heels, stalking into the room and lying down by the fire, never making a sound, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the 3 soldiers on duty. It was a large dog, completely black in colour, with a shaggy curly coat. Its eyes shone balefully, reflecting the firelight. There was something terrifying and unearthly about it, the mysterious way in which it appeared and disappeared, and was seen only at night, its silence and its slinking predatory walk. The men were unnerved by it, and feared its origins were supernatural. They called it simply Moddey Doo, which in the Manx Gaelic tongue means black dog. It might be thought that 3 men sitting in a candlelit room with a warm fire, drinking and gambling, with a dog lying before the grate, would paint a cosy and pleasant scene. But nothing could be further from the truth. The Moddey Doo radiated a palpable menace, and the soldiers sat in a cold sweat of fear, speaking only in hushed murmurs as the black beast's eyes bored into their very souls. Then one night, after the gate had been locked, the man with the keys entered the guardroom. Within a moment, the black dog came slinking in behind him, and lay down beside the fire, its eyes glimmering eerily as they fixed upon him. The man shivered, and decided that he wasn't going to linger in that stare. He nodded to his companions, took the keys in his hand, and moved towards the doorway which led to the connecting passage. The dog rose and began to follow him, crouching low as it crept along. The guard paused in the doorway, and the dog paused behind him, its eyes fixed upon him, full of malice. Trembling with terror, he edged back to the table and sat down with his fellows, the keys clasped tightly in his hand. "I can't do it," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely under control. "I daren't go out there with that damned thing following me. It's not a dog, it's a fiend from hell. I daren't go out there alone." No amount of reassurance would persuade him, nor would taunts and bullying. He was more deathly afraid of the Moddey Doo than he was of the jibes or knocks of his fellow men. "If you're all so brave," he said at last, "one of you can take them." He flung the keys down on the table, daring one of the other 2 to pick them up. But the gauntlet being thrown, the mockery died, for none of the other men dared venture out into that passageway alone, with the dog creeping after them. After several long minutes, the eldest soldier reached out a hand and scooped up the keys. "Here," he said huskily, trying to conceal the tremor in his voice. "I'll go with you, just to show you that it's all right." The two men stepped out into the corridor, and the dog padded after them. They returned several minutes later, the relief plain on their faces, and immediately began drinking heavily and laughing raucously about their own nervous foolishness. But the mood soon subsided, and the night was long and silent and oppressive, for they knew the Moddey Doo haunted them still, and no amount of laughter could remove their peripheral awareness of that black shape that lay watchfully beside the fire. From this time forward, the men always took the keys to the captain's office in pairs, for none of them would set foot in that dim passageway alone after dark. Time passed in this way, and the men began to become used to the eerie presence of the dog. Their minds began to close out the inconvenient questions. Where did it come from? How could it get into a locked castle? Where did it disappear to when the dawn came? For familiarity, alas, will dampen even terror. So it came to pass that on a cold winter's night, the soldier who had locked the castle gates at sunset walked into the guardroom, and within moments the great shaggy figure of the Moddey Doo stole in behind him. It lay down by the fire and stared malefically at the guardsmen. "Who's coming with me then?" asked the soldier with the keys. "Let's get these put away for the night." But one of his companions had already been drinking more heavily than it's wise for a soldier on duty, and a sense of bravado had been fortified by the alcohol, sweeping away his good sense. He pushed himself to his feet now, leaning heavily upon the table. "Nobody's going with you, man," he slurred. "Give me those keys, and I'll take him myself." He held his hand out unsteadily. There was a moment of astonished silence. Then the other two guards began protesting vigorously, each insisting that they'd accompany him, but he was having none of it. "If any of you try to follow me, it'll be the worse for you. I'll knock you down," he threatened. "I'm sick and tired of this nonsense. I tell you, I don't care whether that damned dog's a stray hound or the devil himself. We're sat here cowering from phantom fears for too long. Let it follow me for all I care. I'm not afraid of it." And with that he seized the keys and walked unsteadily from the room, drunk but resolute. The two remaining men quailed in terror when they saw the deadly gleam in the black dog's eyes. They watched in horrified fascination as it slowly rose from its place by the fire, lowering its head as if hunting prey, whilst the shaggy great hackles on its back bristled. Then it padded silently and swiftly out of the guardroom, trailing their companion. There was a period of utter quiet, during which the men scarcely dared to breathe. It seemed like long minutes of unbearable tension, but was probably no more than 10 seconds or so. Then they closed their eyes tight and cringed as the quiet night was rent by a series of heart-rending shrieks of utter terror and despair. The two men sat at the table, sweating and shaking with fear, wringing their hands, until the sound of dragging feet came from the passageway. The third soldier slumped in the doorway, his eyes wide and staring blankly, his mouth hanging slackly open. The keys fell from his nerveless fingers with a startlingly loud clatter, and he slid down to the floor. They hurried to the door and dragged him into the guardroom, glancing with dread down the gloomy passage as they did so, certain that they would see the hellish dog creeping back towards them with the ghost light glowing in its eyes. But there was nothing to be seen. They lay their companion down and covered him, noting with horror when they removed his helmet that his hair had turned completely white. He just lay there, staring blankly ahead, his mind snapped. He lived for 3 more days before death took him, and in that time he spoke not so much as a word. The Moddey Doo was never seen again. Whether it had fulfilled its task after dragging one soul down to perdition, or whether it lingers there still, haunting the ruins of Peel Castle, is impossible to say. But even today, it would still take a very brave person to sit alone in that old guard room after dark and tread down that dark passageway, wondering what crept after. For Fear of Little Men by Michael Kelly.